There's been a number of antagonists in the Fallout series. Some of them are more memorable than others, and everyone has their own favorites. So, here's a top 5 of my favorite antagonists. I will limit this to a pool of main questline antagonists, which could include either the base game or a DLC. So, let's begin. Generally speaking, I liked a bit of what the pit had to offer. It attempts to gray out what many view as a black and white morality system throughout the base game. It provides a fairly interesting environment that, for the most part, bypasses much of the traditional Fallout elements. Although Ashur isn't one of them. Rather, Ashur is from the Brotherhood of Steel, but takes a very brutal approach for controlling the pit. He gathers slaves to work the steel mill, allowing them to become infected with the troglodyte degeneration contagion, while his wife researches a cure for the people that live in the pit, which ultimately comes down to their daughter's immunity. In many respects, Ashur is something of a bandit king, as he uses raiders to control his victims, but one that does have some level of heart, though his extremist methods can make people think twice about helping him. The moral grayness, if only surface level, does make him rather unique, if optional, antagonist. Still, I put him fairly low on the list because it kinda gets confusing what his goals really are. Is he more concerned about curing the people of the pit, or is he more interested in leading an industrial force? If it's the former, it seems like he could just lead the people out of the pit and let the disease run its course. As for many people, skin lesions are the extent of the damage that will clear up in about a month after leaving the pit, according to his wife's notes. If it's actually the latter, wanting to have that industrial power, which he does emphasize in his speech, then yeah, this whole thing makes a lot of sense, especially considering he imports slaves who will get infected with TDC, is ultimately a self-centered goal, one that's built off the broken backs of the diseased workers, but a rational if brutal one. Father Elijah is a desperate, obsessed man that in some ways does sort of reflect Ashur, at least in the sense that he uses slaves to further his own goal in an incredibly hostile environment. That said, unlike Ashur, there isn't much of a gray line at all. He wants a technology of the Sierra Madre to rain hell down upon the Mojave, which can be done in one of the endings if the player sides with Elijah.
Perhaps I was too quick to put a collar on a potential ally.
I also find his voice acting and speech mannerisms rather intriguing. Father Elijah is absolutely mad, and every bit of that is fascinating to me. Speaking of mad, the think tank, Mobius included, is full of comical insanity topped with some of the most wild writing I've seen for this franchise. Truthfully, each floating brain pod is filled with Saturday morning cartoon characterization to me. These guys should not work as well as they do. They had every single excuse to be a complete miss, but somehow they fit into the same world as the hellish wastelands we have seen. It is not just the think tank, the entire big mountain area is full of the most zany nonsense that, again, should not work, but for some reason totally does. It might be because the writing tells you from the start just how not serious the entire premise is with the arguing members of the think tank, and maybe the isolation of the research facility does help to keep it separate from the general Mojave. I include Mobius in all this because he was a think tank member for a long time and still feels like part of the gang. Ultimately, you learn that he took a bit of a self-sacrifice to scare his old comrades away from unleashing their experiments onto the world. But even with that, he's still about as kooky as they are, but at least has his heart in the right place.
They were my friends, but sometimes they would take things too far. And the world isn't ready for that kind of too far thing-taking.
Highly charismatic, extremely proficient in most of his executions, and rather unshaken with the ideals of morality, he rules the strip with the iron fist wrapped up in fake corporate pleasantries. He's a self-admitted autocrat that doesn't care about what people do in their private time. He's convinced a fair number of first-time players to join him in reshaping the Mojave, and does it while fulfilling his financial promises to you. He's all business all the time, a bit of a wizard behind the curtain when those who portray him choose to release his feeble, uncontaminated body to the world. Of course, he's a mind stuck in the past, but uses it to rule the future. He's another case of gray morals, a dictator that cares only for his home territory, yet plans to expand to the stars. Still, it's not unreasonable to be wary about trusting the future to a single person. So here's a few honorable mentions. Blackburn, a scientist and well-intended apologetic extremist in Fallout 76. I find his characterization to be fairly interesting. He wants to do good for the wasteland but takes such a brutal method of doing so. He He has shown that he generally hates creating the abominations of supermutants and forcing humans into his experiments, but he feels that the ends justify the means. Still, between how short the storyline is and the ending causing him to immediately turn into a behemoth, which annoys me on a nerdy level, I feel it dampens a lot of what built him up. Kellogg, a highly trained mercenary from the West Coast. He's the first main antagonist of 4. Killing him marks the midway point of the story. Truthfully, to me, what makes him interesting is exploring his history by seeing his memories. You get a fair few fun shoutouts to the West Coast, which is pretty nice. I feel like more interesting stuff could have been done with him though. Caesar. I like the background story for the most part. Destroying tribes, uniting them into a large army and nation is pretty cool. But I'll be honest, I don't dig on the whole surface level Roman legion aesthetic all that much. It appeals to some, but for me, Eden and Autumn. More exploration into them and the Enclave as a whole in 3 would have done wonders to make this pair more interesting. I like the conflict of ideology and power, but the execution isn't great. The whole Enclave base exchange is so quick that it kind of feels like a bit of a letdown. Frank Horrigan. I want to double him up with Richardson like I did with Eden and Autumn. But the truth is that Richardson serves his mild role pretty well. He's simply a figurehead for the Enclave's beliefs. Horrigan is a bit different. He's the epitome of rule of cool. Basically, what would become a super mutant behemoth in advanced power armor. High health, high damage, but he's little else beyond being the endgame boss. I suppose he's a bit of an antithesis what people would expect if they played the first game, since you are unable to talk him down. You have to fight Horrigan, or at least have others doing the fighting for you. But to my number 1. You knew it was going to be this. Typical answer, I know, but there's a reason. In a series full of flesh and machine combinations, along with using speech checks to best mini baddies, the originator of that still remains relatively fresh. The Master is a fellow icon of well-intentioned extremism, and feels like he influenced a fair bit of Blackburn's writing. Though while Blackburn was apologetic, the Master was not. At least, not until you told him that his intentions were all for naught. In that moment, he decides to end his life and the lives of many of his worshippers and mutants. The Master is disgusting to look at, disturbing to listen to, but in many ways his ideals are not without reasoning. If super mutants could reproduce, he might have ultimately been right all along. In conjunction with his arguably more zealous lieutenant, he remains untouched in the eyes of many Fallout fans, myself included, as the best antagonist. One that can be emulated, but never replicated. But that's my list. Who are your favorite antagonists? Let me know in the comments below.
Very demanding for one in your tenuous position, but I can respect your needs.
A very special thanks to my channel members, especially the Members Thrice Over members like That Crazy Game Developer and Denny McPhee. If you wish to support me and join us well, I'd be more than happy. Otherwise, like, share, subscribe, all that typical YouTube stuff. Thank you. Have a good one.